I'm now going to show you a more in-depth look at the Erosion Custom node uh, for height field terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a height field terrain, open up the editor, and let's go ahead and make it a little more interesting. I'll just use the Voronoi generalized, turn off zero edges. We could add a bit of rotation to it. If you want, we can go in and edit the profile. And if we change the randomness, we can get things more uniform, or we can vary them out a little more. What I also want to do is just edit the filter and level it out a little to give us some variation. And click OK. And then if we see these areas down here that are flattened out, and we don't want that to show up, what you can do is add in a filter. So right click, filter. We're going to use offset, and that's just going to raise up the output. So if let's see the node preview, so if it's going too low, we can raise it up a little higher, and that will prevent it from being cut off. Now if we want, we can have a little bit of a cutoff in some of those areas. And I am probably going to go ahead and change the altitude. But if I increase the largest feature enough, I shouldn't need to. Yeah, that looks okay. And I am going to leave some of those flat areas. Okay, so now what we're going to do is just add in the Erosion Custom. So we go to Height Field, Erosion Custom. Connect that to the offset, and before I connect it, I'm also going to add in Height Field Auto Mapping. And this should be the last thing you have before the altitude. And then I just want to see the height. It looks like I do have size on here and 135 meters. And right now it's just using the default or generic erosion. And even that looks pretty neat in of itself. Okay, so primary features, major functions here. And I've gone over this before, but just to refresh, vertical scale, you want to make sure that the amount of erosion you want, or the height of the erosion, should be at least the size, the vertical height of the terrain. In this case, it's 135, so we're going up to about 200, which should be good. We can maybe bring that down a little. If you go too low and you want to just affect a lower part of the terrain, it can have some issues sometimes for the areas that aren't being eroded above, and it may not match up properly. And then underneath that is the timescale, which is going to affect the overall processing, how many passes are being done over the terrain. Okay, so if we go through here, and what we got is the smallest feature option. This isn't really going to show up much right now with the low-res terrain. As we get higher and higher, 2K, 4K, and 8K, then that becomes more important for fine details. So if you're not quite getting enough detail, you can decrease that smallest feature. And right now, we're probably not going to see any sort of a change from that, just because we have a lower resolution. It looks about the same. And if we go to favor larger features, it's going to decrease the erosion look that we have right now. I'm just going to bump it up a little higher, and you can see we start to see some of the larger sections being having a different kind of erosion. And as we bring that up higher and higher, we'll see more bumpy terrain. and some of those bigger features showing through. I'm going to bring that back down to about 0.5. And if we go over to quality boost, it can give some interesting changes. Sometimes I like to go into negative values, and you can see how we get a very different look to the terrain where it starts to flatten things out, and it looks pretty interesting that way. I'm going to go ahead and reset that back to 0. See that update there. If we go down to the terrain properties, we have the erosion strength, and you have to be careful with this one because it can gouge your terrain quite a bit, especially if you're making changes like this at a higher resolution, and then you wait for a while for it to process and it's not quite there. So anything higher than 1 is going to possibly be too much. And you can see just by raising it up a little, it was a drastic change, and it's going to not look very good. So I'm going to increase it to about 6, and you can see what happens a little further. And sometimes you get something interesting. This one actually doesn't look too bad, but most of the time you end up with really rough edges. And a lot of times it's just unusable. And then we have the ability to make the rocks or these larger peaks a little sharper. And like I said, some of these may not be really obvious at a lower resolution. If we go over to the erosion emphasis, which I like to modify a lot, and gives you a nice change here. We'll just let that process for a sec. And actually, after that refreshed, wasn't really seeing much of a change, so I went ahead and just increased the resolution a little bit. And right now we can see the erosion emphasis at 10, and I'm going to go ahead and change it down to 0, and we should see it a little bumpier and not quite as prominent. So we'll just let that update. And now we can see it's a lot rougher around a lot of the areas, and we don't see the erosion smoothing it out as much. I'm going to go ahead and bring that back up. Another thing I want to note is a lot of these parameters are going to have different effects on different types of geometry. So a lot of times they won't produce the same settings on the same terrains. And I wish there was an easy way just to say, oh, this is exactly what it's going to do to this terrain, this is exactly what it's going to do to this part of the terrain. But unfortunately, I mean, it's going to vary greatly depending on the geometry, the shape of the terrain, and the height, and lots of different factors, also depending on the different presets that are available. So a lot of times you just have to play around with it on your terrain and see what it does. Typically the best way to do that is a lower resolution, because you don't want to be messing around with things at a too high of a res. I've had 8K terrains that take about 20 minutes, sometimes they take up to 40 minutes, and waiting that long between changes is just not useful whatsoever. And some of these features, depending on the preset, can also have little to no effect. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. You really have to just take some time with this node and play around with it. I wish I could just sit here and show you every single thing it can do, but that would take a very long time. So I just want to give you a good starting point. And one thing I really like about the presets is they do give you a really good look right off the bat, so you don't have to mess around with them too much. And a lot of times you don't really use the Erosion Custom to make too many drastic changes, because you can just switch between the presets for that. And you just want to maybe go in and fine-tune a few things, and that's kind of the best way to use it. I want to go down here over to just skip to the weathering parameters, and Now it's going to depend on the terrain, but with the bank erosion, what I normally see and normally get out of it is less of a flattening towards the bottom of the terrain. We'll see if we can get that off of this one. So I'm going to turn off or bring down the bank erosion, and that should affect the lower areas of the terrain, and it has worked well with generic before. And we can see it did raise it up. So we're getting the low-res preview, and then it starts generating each next step. And it's nice because it gives you a good idea right away without having to wait for the full detail. So basically, the bank erosion is just thinking about the bank and the water, the lower levels, and flattening those out as needed. But if you don't want everything to level out towards the bottom, and you want to still have a nice rocky terrain, we can see right now that we don't have that smoothing towards the bottom, and we get these nice peaks throughout. For the transition, it won't have much of an impact without the actual erosion on. So if we turn up the bank erosion, which is going to flatten things out again, then we can adjust the transition and kind of smooth them into each other. Now, this is still processing, and the transition amount will increase the processing time by quite a bit. We can see that we have, with the bank erosion back on, flattening towards the bottom, and then the transition lifts it up a little higher into the other peaks. I'm going to turn this down and have it reprocess a little lower and see if it comes up quicker. Because before I was waiting about 10 minutes, and this is a very low resolution terrain. So now I've just brought it down to 6, and now it's going much faster, but we see less smoothing and less of that bank coming up higher, which can sometimes produce some pretty cool looks, but I was able to reproduce that by just decreasing the quality, or the quality boost. So that finished up a lot quicker than the last time, but with smaller amounts it may not be necessary to use it at all. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it off, and we shouldn't see that big of a difference. We'll just wait for it to update, and it looks like it's going to be about the same. So unless you're going to use a higher amount, it might not be worth it, but the amount of time it takes to process the transition is quite a bit. So it could be a couple hundred times longer of a wait. And if we look at it, having that lower version before a transition of 6 wasn't really enough to make it worth processing. So if we go over here to the clamp flow, we're going to bounce back up here to the flow parameters. Now once we bring this down lower, we're going to see less erosion overall. Just let that update. And not so much less erosion, just less of the flow channels. So setting the higher number will give you more detail in there, and if we set it lower, it's going to clamp at a lower amount, so it'll be smoother, as you can see here. We've lost a lot of those fine channels that were showing up before in the thin details. And then you can bring it up a little higher if you want them to be a little more prominent. And then we can also set the depth limit a little higher too if we wanted to go a little deeper and gouge into the terrain more. And I also want to note that some of these features in the custom node are going to impact the outputs more than they're going to impact what we can see for the geometry of the terrain. And if we go over to channeling threshold, and let's go ahead and increase that a little, we should see, and we can see it start to go down a lot further into the terrain. And some of these sliders too, once they're processed at a higher level, you can sometimes bump them down a little bit without losing any of the detail and having to wait for it to reprocess. At least for some of them, you might notice that. Most of the changes will require the terrain to reprocess itself. And now it's going deeper into the bank erosion. So sometimes you can also get basically the same result with different sliders because they interact with each other so much and are dependent on each other in a lot of ways. So increasing the channeling threshold was similar in this case to reducing the bank erosion. And going down into the flow depth limit, right now it's set to 5. Let's go ahead and increase that a little higher. And not a drastic change there. And sometimes increasing one slider or decreasing it too much will nullify the other changes you've made on some of the other settings. I'm going to bring down the channeling threshold a little and bring down that depth limit to 1. And now the channels are not nearly as deep as they were before. And another thing I want to note is most of the top sliders are an overall change of what's below them. So overall flow level will increase or decrease depending on which way you go. All of the features below this and thermal weathering, same thing down here. It can be different. And I want to go ahead and increase my depth limit a little bit and then increase my flow level, and we'll take a look. And you can see a very drastic change. So we'll go down here, bring it back to 0.4 or so. I'm at 0.48. I'll go ahead and bring it down just a little. And we'll bring down that depth limit. And that's back a little closer to what I'm looking for. So let's also take a look. There's an option here that's grayed out, which is the flow surface output. One way to take a look at that, and I am going to go ahead and just decrease the terrain really quick so it processes faster. But I'm going to connect this to the flow surface, and then we can adjust the evaporation amount on the bottom here. Now going too high is essentially going to give you the same output as the altitude output. And sometimes you'll see really flat areas, and sometimes it'll be smoother where the cracks are more filled in, and that's going to depend on whichever preset you're using. And in this case, we do have some flatter areas once we reduce that evaporation amount, and that is going to make the difference between the altitude and the flow surface. So back to altitude. I'll just go ahead and increase that. Let's do it twice, and I'm going to let it process at 1024, so 1K terrain, and just go ahead and let that go for a minute or two. And there it is at 1K. And it looks pretty interesting. Got some nice details on it. And I'm just going to go ahead and edit the material, edit the color, and let's make it kind of a darker brown. And I'm just going to do a quick render. And with these lower resolution terrains, if you need to render closer, which you probably won't be rendering this far away, then you have to really start looking at how you're going to use your bump channels within your materials and setting up different materials to bring out the features. And that way we don't have such a smooth look as we're seeing right here. But you can create some really realistic looking effects from just materials themselves. So getting just that rough shape from a terrain can be useful enough a lot of the time.